I didn't plan on tearing anything down that morning, but the moment I crested the North Ridge and saw a full-sized house squatting on my land like it had always belonged there, I knew someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The day was bright and clear, the kind of sharp mountain daylight that leaves no room for shadows or excuses, and I was riding my ATV along a trail I'd walked, measured, and maintained for more than 2 decades, checking boundary markers after a rough winter the same way I always did, calm, methodical, and unhurried, until polished glass flashed between the trees where only pine and stone should have been. I slowed without thinking, killed the engine, and let the silence settle, that deep mountain quiet broken only by wind and the distant call of birds. And then I stepped forward, boots crunching over needles and gravel, feeling that cold, sinking certainty spread through my chest as the forest opened up and revealed a luxury structure planted dead center on my property. It wasn't a shed or a hunting blind or some half-finished shack someone might mistake for an honest error. It was a house, a real one, with stone columns, wide decks, fresh lumber, and floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the sky like a dare. Built boldly, confidently, as if whoever ordered it believed ownership was something you could claim just by acting entitled enough. I didn't shout or rush or touch anything at first, because years of dealing with land disputes and legal fights had taught me that the fastest way to lose control was to let emotion drive. So instead I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I verified. I pulled out my GPS, opened the parcel overlays I'd checked 100 times before, and watched the red boundary lines settle on the screen with merciless clarity, showing my position squarely inside my land, not near an edge, not brushing a line but deep within it. The house sitting like a misplaced piece on a board game no one had asked to play. The anger came after the certainty, slow and heavy, not loud, because this wasn't just trespass, it was audacity, the kind that takes planning, permits ignored, surveys dismissed, and a quiet confidence that no one would challenge it. And as I walked the perimeter, the details told the rest of the story. Reinforced footings, custom windows, new decking, materials hauled up a trail that had never seen construction traffic without me knowing, meaning someone had invested serious money and time into doing this behind my back. The boards were new enough to smell of resin, sawdust still dusting the porch, electrical boxes open and waiting, like the builders had expected to come back and finish once the paperwork caught up to the fantasy. And that assumption was what bothered me most, because mistakes hesitate, but this didn't, it announced itself. I stepped inside, daylight pouring through unfinished windows, and found no personal items, no furniture, no tools left behind, just a structure paused mid-breath, abandoned recently and deliberately, which told me whoever was responsible knew exactly what they were doing and had decided to disappear before questions started. That's when I noticed the tracks behind the house, deep and fresh, likely from heavy equipment pulled out in a hurry, and that confirmed it wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move that had gone one step too far. I began documenting immediately, narrating calmly, marking time and location, walking the boundary again on camera, because panic leaves gaps and gaps get exploited. And if someone was bold enough to build a house on land they didn't own, they'd be bold enough to lie about it later. As I worked, the quiet clarity of the situation settled in. This wasn't a neighbor dispute, it wasn't a zoning mix-up. It was an encroachment backed by confidence and money. And the only group in the area with both the motive and the history to attempt something like this was the Homeowner Association down the mountain, the same one that had been pushing expansion rumors for years, talking about future development opportunities and community growth while pretending my ridge didn't exist. I'd never been part of that association, never signed anything, never given permission, and that independence had always irritated them. But irritation alone doesn't pour concrete or cut timber, so as I stood there in full daylight looking at a house that didn't belong, I understood something important. This was the opening move of a much bigger play, and whoever made it assumed I'd either never notice or back down quietly once lawyers got involved. I finished my documentation, took one last look at the structure, and felt that internal shift happen, the one where a situation stops being surprising and starts being procedural. Because land doesn't care about titles or boards or associations. It only recognizes records, boundaries, and actions, and every survey I'd ever commissioned, every marker I'd maintained, every map on file was on my side. By the time I rode back down the trail, the sun was higher, the light harsher, and my plan was already forming, not out of anger but out of necessity. Because leaving that house standing would invite more problems, more claims, more manufactured confusion, and I wasn't about to let someone else rewrite reality on my land. I made the calls that needed to be made, not to complain but to prepare, lining up equipment, confirming legal standing, reviewing abatement doctrine. Because when an illegal structure poses risk and sits on private property, the law doesn't require permission from the people who caused the problem. By early afternoon, the ridge was still, the house unchanged, and the sky as clear as it had been that morning, but the direction of the day had shifted completely, because I wasn't just a landowner who'd found a problem anymore, I was a landowner who was about to remove one. And I knew that once the first beam came down, the people behind it wouldn't stay quiet. They'd come fast, loud, and angry, armed with paperwork, threats, and lawsuits, convinced the sheer weight of their authority would crush me. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet, and standing there in the open daylight, looking back toward the illegal house one last time before action replaced observation, I understood exactly how this story would end up where it always does when arrogance meets evidence. In court, with them suing me for millions, and me ready to explain in exact detail why I tore their house down. By the time the first piece of equipment climbed the ridge under the glare of the afternoon sun, the situation had already moved past discovery and into consequence. Because illegal structures don't get more legal with time, they only get more dangerous, and I wasn't interested in giving anyone room to pretend confusion later. The air was dry and bright, dust hanging briefly before settling as the machines parked with deliberate care. And before anything touched the house, I finished one last sweep of documentation, narrating clearly, calmly, noting the lack of permits posted, the absence of boundary markers beyond my own, the exposed wiring, the shallow footings visible where soil had already slumped. All signs that this build wasn't just unlawful but rushed, careless, and hazardous. When the first beam was tested and the structure answered with a hollow groan, it confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a home, it was a liability masquerading as one, and leaving it standing would invite injury, collapse, or worse, which under abatement doctrine put responsibility squarely on the landowner to act. The demolition itself was controlled and methodical. No reckless swinging, no theatrics, just careful disassembly guided by experience and gravity, wood folding inward, decking coming loose plank by plank, the house surrendering its shape far more easily than it ever should have. And as pieces came down, the mountain seemed to reclaim its space without ceremony. That calm didn't last. The sound of a high-performance engine clawing its way up the trail cut through the afternoon like an insult. And moments later, a luxury car appeared where no luxury car belonged, paint gleaming obscenely against dust and pine, stopping short as its driver took in the scene. Half the deck gone, beams stacked, equipment idling, and the fantasy project unraveling in full daylight. The man who stepped out moved with the kind of fury that comes from entitlement being challenged, shouting accusations before he was even within range, waving papers he claimed proved everything, insisting the Homeowner Association had authority, approval, vision, words he kept repeating as if saying them louder would make them true. He demanded work stop immediately, threatened police, threatened courts, threatened to bury me in legal action. And when that didn't slow anything down, he escalated the only way people like that know how, by calling in reinforcements, men who arrived not to reason but to intimidate, crowding space, puffing chests, assuming proximity equaled power. I didn't argue or shout back, because every second they spent talking was another second the structure came down safely, and every word they said was being recorded in the same clear daylight they thought would protect them. When one of those men put hands on me, shoving hard enough to raise dust but not enough to change the outcome, the line crossed from bluster into evidence. And from that point on, everything that followed belonged to the record, not their narrative. The scuffle was brief, clumsy, fueled by ego rather than skill, and it ended the same way most intimidation attempts do when met with calm resistance, with them overextended, embarrassed, and suddenly aware of how bad this looked from the outside. That's when the paperwork came out, a supposed contract thrust forward as proof I had approved the build. A document that looked official until you knew what to look for, the flatness of the ink, the copied signature, the lack of original impression. A forgery so sloppy it was almost insulting, and the moment it changed hands on camera, the situation shifted again, from dispute to potential criminal exposure. Sirens echoed up the ridge not long after, deputies arriving to assess a scene already neatly catalogued. And while accusations flew in all directions, the evidence didn't move, it stayed exactly where it was, showing who initiated contact, who trespassed, who built illegally, and who tried to cover it after the fact. The deputies didn't arrest anyone that day, but they didn't need to, because the matter had already outgrown roadside authority and entered a space where documents, footage, and intent would do the talking. And as they advised suspending further demolition pending review, I complied without hesitation, because compliance at the right moment is as powerful as action. That evening, as the sun dropped lower and the ridge cooled, I thought the escalation had peaked, that the worst of it was behind me, but arrogance rarely accepts a first loss. And true to form, retaliation came disguised as procedure the very next morning when federal inspectors arrived unannounced, citing anonymous complaints about hazardous waste and environmental violations at the demolition site. It was a transparent move, meant to shift pressure, to create doubt, to smear through bureaucracy what couldn't be won through force. But it fell apart under scrutiny the same way the house had, because staged debris leaves traces, mismatched footprints, wrong materials, and conveniently missing timelines, all of which were easily contradicted by continuous footage and ultimately night vision trail camera evidence showing the same luxury vehicle returning after dark to dump construction waste where it didn't belong. That revelation didn't end the escalation, it refined it, turning bluster into panic and threats into silence as agencies began talking to each other instead of listening to accusations. And by the time the inspectors left with copies of the footage and a very different understanding of who was responsible, it was clear the Homeowner Association hadn't just overreached, they'd multiplied their exposure at every turn. Still, they weren't done because the next weapon they reached for was the only one they had left. Money and the courts, and within days the lawsuit arrived, thick, dramatic, inflated with claims of destruction, emotional distress, and damages in the millions, filed not because they expected to win on facts, but because they believed the sheer cost and pressure would force a retreat. Standing there in the same daylight where this all began, holding a summons that reeked of desperation, I understood the escalation phase was complete, the masks were off, and the fight was no longer about a house on a ridge, it was about whether truth and procedure could outlast intimidation when backed by money. And as I read through their claims line by line, already cross-referencing each with evidence they had created themselves, I knew the next stage wouldn't be louder or messier, it would be colder, sharper. And far more dangerous for them, because now the story belonged to a courtroom, and courts have very little patience for people who try to sue their way out of the truth. The real crisis didn't arrive with raised voices or machinery or even the lawsuit itself. It arrived quietly, wrapped in official language and delivered in broad daylight, the way the most dangerous problems always do, because a few days after the summons landed, thick with exaggerated claims and impossible numbers, the pressure campaign began in earnest, methodical, and relentless, designed not to win on truth but to exhaust through volume. Letters arrived from firms I'd never dealt with, each one escalating the tone, warning of liens, asset freezes, injunctions, and reputational damage, as if repeating the threats in different fonts might make them real. And at the same time, neighbors from miles away began calling, men I barely knew asking cautious questions about rumors they'd heard, about whether I'd gone rogue, about whether the Homeowner Association really had authority to do what it claimed. Which told me the narrative machine was already running, pumping out a version of events that painted me as reckless and them as victims. The lawsuit itself was absurd in scale, alleging not just destruction of property but conspiracy, harassment, and long-term economic harm, numbers stacked so high they were meant to intimidate rather than withstand scrutiny. And as I read it under the harsh midday light at my workbench, every accusation felt less like an argument and more like a dare, an attempt to see if I'd blink when confronted with the full weight of institutional aggression. What made it worse wasn't the paper, it was the timing, because while the legal threats escalated, practical consequences began to stack up as well. Phone calls from insurers asking pointed questions, banks requesting clarification, suppliers hesitating, all of it triggered by filings that were public by design, meant to ripple outward and create friction in every corner of my life. That's when the Homeowner Association pushed their boldest move yet, filing for an emergency injunction demanding immediate restoration of the demolished structure, an impossible request on its face, but one crafted to force a court appearance on short notice, to put me on defense before the full evidence was even reviewed. And standing there reading that filing, I understood the shape of the trap they were setting. If I complied, I'd be admitting fault. If I couldn't, they'd frame it as defiance, and either way, they'd claim leverage. The days tightened after that, each one bringing another demand, another deadline, another carefully worded threat. And even though I knew the law, even though I knew the facts, there's a particular kind of pressure that comes from being outnumbered on paper, from watching a well-funded organization throw everything it has at you at once, hoping something sticks simply because you can't swat it all away in time. The stress wasn't dramatic. It was grinding, showing up in small ways, interrupted sleep, meals forgotten, the constant low hum of anticipation every time a vehicle slowed near the property, wondering which agency or courier it might be this time. And for the first time since this began, I felt the weight of how far they were willing to go to avoid admitting they decrossed a line. The injunction hearing was scheduled for a bright morning, sunlight pouring through the courthouse windows as if mocking the tension in the room. And as I stood there alone at the defense table, stacks of documents neatly organized but not yet deployed, I could feel the imbalance they were counting on. A lone landowner facing an array of suits and suits, confident that optics alone would do half their work. Their arguments came fast, loaded with righteous language about community standards and irreversible harm, painting the illegal structure as a benevolent project cruelly destroyed. And for a moment, watching the judge listen without interruption, I could see how someone unfamiliar with the details might hesitate, might wonder if restraint should have come before action. That was the moment the crisis peaked, the narrow window where uncertainty could tip the scales. Because if the court granted even temporary relief, the narrative would shift instantly, emboldening them and validating every aggressive move they'd made so far. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't argue emotion, I argued sequence, laying out timelines, permits absent, boundaries verified, risks documented. And I could see the shift happen in real time, the judge's questions sharpening, probing not what I did, but why the Homeowner Association had acted as if the land didn't belong to anyone at all. The injunction was denied, not with fanfare, but with a quiet firmness that sucked the air out of their momentum. And as I stepped back into the daylight afterward, relief mixed with a sobering realization. This wasn't over, it had simply changed shape. Losing the injunction didn't stop them, it enraged them, and that afternoon the filings doubled, amended complaints adding new claims, new numbers, new theories, each one weaker than the last, but all of them demanding time, response, and energy. The crisis settled into a siege, not dramatic enough to draw sympathy, not simple enough to resolve quickly, just a sustained attempt to bleed resources and resolve until walking away seemed cheaper than standing firm. And I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a moment, standing alone on the ridge in full daylight, looking at the scar where the house had been when the question surfaced. Was it worth it? The answer came not from anger but from clarity, because backing down wouldn't undo what they'd already done. It would only invite more of it, and the mountain doesn't reward retreat from truth. Still, the pressure intensified when a second lawsuit followed the first, this one targeting ancillary actions, claiming interference, seeking discovery so broad it was meant to overwhelm. And that was when I felt truly cornered, not legally, but logistically, the sheer volume threatening to consume every hour if I let it. That sense of being boxed in, of standing alone against a system that assumed it could outlast me, was the heart of the crisis, the moment where endurance mattered more than any single piece of evidence, because they were betting that fatigue would succeed where intimidation hadn't. Standing there under the same relentless sun that had illuminated the illegal build weeks earlier, I understood that the next move couldn't be reactive, couldn't be another response to their aggression. It had to be something that changed the balance entirely, something that turned their confidence into liability. And as that realization settled in, cold and steady, I knew the turning point wouldn't come from fighting harder, it would come from exposing something they never expected to be seen. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden apology. It arrived with a thin envelope slid under my door in the middle of a bright afternoon, unmarked, unadorned, and heavy in the way only truth ever is. I noticed it because it didn't match the rest of the mail, no logos, no return address, just my name written carefully, deliberately by someone who didn't want to be seen but very much wanted to be heard. And as I opened it at the workbench under full daylight, I felt that familiar shift, the one where noise drops away and focus sharpens. Inside were printed emails, meeting minutes, internal memoranda, all clearly originating from within the Homeowner Association, dated weeks before the illegal house ever went up, outlining discussions about strategic expansion, ridge acquisition through pressure, and contingency plans if I resisted. Language so blunt it bordered on arrogant, as if the authors believed their internal communications would never see the light of day. I read through them slowly, once for content and once for context, and what emerged was devastatingly clear. The build wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an overzealous contractor. It was a calculated decision by the association's leadership to test the limits of their power, to plant a structure on my land, force a confrontation, and then leverage their resources to either coerce a settlement or grind me down through litigation until they could claim the ridge as a fait accompli. There were references to reserve funds earmarked for legal containment, discussions about delaying tactics, and even a line noting that I rarely invited scrutiny because of my isolation, which turned my stomach not with fear but with a cold understanding of how deliberate this all had been. I cross-checked dates, sender names, and metadata, confirming authenticity piece by piece, and by the time I finished, the picture was complete. Intent, coordination, misuse of funds, and a paper trail they never expected to surface. I didn't rush to file anything immediately because the power of evidence like this isn't in how fast you swing it. It's in where you place it. So instead I organized, indexed, and corroborated, matching internal plans to external actions, emails to timelines, decisions to outcomes, until the narrative they'd tried to impose collapsed under its own weight. Under the same bright daylight that had exposed the illegal house, I requested records through formal channels, confident now that resistance would only add to the record. And as expected, the responses came back incomplete, redacted, evasive, which only strengthened the case, because omissions speak as loudly as admissions when you know what's missing. I forwarded the complete packet to the appropriate authorities, not with accusations but with documentation, letting the facts introduce themselves, and within days, the tone of the entire situation shifted. The lawsuits didn't stop, but they slowed, filings less aggressive, deadlines extended, the confidence bleeding out as quietly as it had once surged. And then the calls began, not from opposing counsel posturing, but from investigators asking precise, uncomfortable questions about approvals, expenditures, and jurisdiction. The association's leadership, so loud and certain before, suddenly went silent, replaced by representatives who spoke carefully, choosing words like men walking across thin ice, because they knew now that this wasn't just a civil dispute anymore, it was a potential exposure of governance failures that could unravel careers. The most telling moment came when a motion was filed by the association itself requesting a temporary stay to review internal compliance matters. Language so sanitized it almost masked the panic underneath. And reading it, I understood they'd finally realized the scale of what they'd set in motion. In the meantime, a state oversight body opened a formal inquiry, requesting documents I already had and others they clearly didn't want to provide. And the association's narrative, once so confident and expansive, began to fracture publicly as board members distanced themselves. Resignations quietly submitted, emergency meetings called and canceled, the structure of authority wobbling under scrutiny it had never anticipated. Standing on the ridge one afternoon, the sun high and unforgiving, looking out over land that had been mine long before any of them took an interest, I felt the pressure lift just enough to breathe, not because the fight was over, but because the balance had shifted decisively. The turning point wasn't just that I had evidence, it was that the evidence revealed motive, and motive changes everything because courts can argue over actions, but they don't forgive intent. As the inquiries progressed, the association's legal posture weakened visibly, arguments abandoned, claims narrowed, settlement language creeping into correspondence that once dripped with threats. And when an amended complaint quietly dropped the most inflammatory accusations, it confirmed what I already knew. They were trying to survive now, not dominate. The lawsuits that had once felt overwhelming began to look brittle. Their foundations exposed the same way the illegal houses had been. And for the first time since this began, I saw a clear path forward that didn't involve endurance alone, but resolution on my terms. The turning point wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't involve a courtroom victory or a public apology. It was simply the moment when the truth surfaced in full daylight and refused to be buried again. When the people who had assumed they could act without consequence realized they had misjudged both the land and the man who owned it. And as I gathered the final pieces of documentation that afternoon, the sun casting long, sharp shadows across the ridge, I understood that the next phase wouldn't be about defending myself anymore. It would be about watching accountability do its work, slow, methodical, and unavoidable. Because once intent is proven, the rest is just process. And process, unlike intimidation, always finishes what it starts. The resolution didn't come with a single dramatic verdict or a sudden confession. It unfolded the way accountability usually does when it's unavoidable, quietly, methodically, and entirely in daylight, stripping away bravado one layer at a time until nothing was left but consequences. The first sign was the lawsuits themselves beginning to collapse under their own weight, amended filings narrowing claims, inflated damage numbers quietly reduced, language softened from outrage to procedure. And then, without announcement, one of the cases was withdrawn entirely, dismissed by the very people who had sworn they'd pursue it to the end. The remaining suit limped forward just long enough for discovery to do what it always does when intent is exposed, forcing uncomfortable disclosures, financial records, internal communications, and board votes into the open. And as those documents surfaced, the narrative the Homeowner Association had tried so hard to sell finally broke apart in public view. It became impossible to ignore that funds had been authorized for land they didn't own, that legal reserves were earmarked not for defense but for coercion, and that the decision to build on my ridge had been discussed, approved, and celebrated internally as a calculated risk, not a mistake. Under that kind of scrutiny, leadership doesn't hold, it fractures, and within weeks resignations began stacking up, board members stepping down for personal reasons, officers distancing themselves from decisions they had once endorsed, and emergency elections called not to fix anything but to contain the fallout. The state inquiry moved faster after that, expanding its scope, requesting sworn statements, cross-referencing financials, and when the association's attorneys stopped returning calls with confidence and started asking for extensions, it was clear the power dynamic had reversed completely. The final blow came on a clear morning when a formal notice arrived confirming what had become inevitable. All remaining claims against me were dismissed with prejudice, legal fees awarded, and a separate referral made for further review of the association's conduct, language so precise and devastating it left no room for reinterpretation. The threat of millions evaporated in a single document, replaced by a very real risk for the people who had created the mess in the first place. And as I stood there reading it in full sunlight, the same ridge stretching out beyond the windows, I felt not triumph, but a deep, steady calm settle in. The Homeowner Association issued a public statement later that day, carefully worded, devoid of names, acknowledging jurisdictional overreach and procedural failures. Phrases designed to sound administrative while admitting everything that mattered, and not long after, updated maps were published clarifying boundaries that should never have been questioned. A clean line drawn that permanently excluded my land from their reach. The illegal house was never mentioned again, not because it was forgotten, but because acknowledging it meant acknowledging everything else, and silence became their final strategy. Life on the ridge returned to its rhythm slowly, not instantly, but with each passing day the tension eased, the calls stopped, the rumors faded, and the mountain reclaimed the space where arrogance had briefly taken root. Neighbors who had watched from a distance began to speak openly again, men stopping by not to pry, but to say what they'd been holding back for years, that they'd felt bullied, sidelined, pressured by the same people who thought they could take my land without consequence. And hearing that confirmed something important. This had never just been about one structure, it had been about whether unchecked authority would be allowed to stand. The association elected new leadership, quieter, careful, almost cautious to a fault. And while I had no interest in their internal politics, the change was visible. Enforcement actions paused, rules reviewed, the tone shifting from command to compliance. Because once power is exposed, it never fully recovers its old shape. Standing on the ridge one afternoon, the sun high, the air clear, I looked out over ground that was once again unmistakably mine. Not marked by concrete or glass, but by pine, stone, and the honest absence of intrusion, and I understood that tearing down the illegal house had been the simplest part of this entire ordeal. The real work had been standing firm when intimidation escalated, trusting procedure over panic, and letting evidence do what it's meant to do when given enough light. The Homeowner Association never apologized, and they didn't need to because the outcome spoke louder than any statement ever could. They lost their claims, their credibility, their leadership, and their assumed right to act without consequence. I wasn't sued into silence, I wasn't buried under legal pressure, and I didn't surrender an inch of land because the truth doesn't require permission to stand, it only requires someone willing to hold it in place long enough for the rest to catch up. As the sun dropped slightly and shadows stretched across the ridge, the same land that had sparked this entire conflict now sat undisturbed, honest and quiet. And I knew that if anyone ever tried something like that again, not just here but anywhere, this story would serve as a reminder that daylight, documentation, and resolve outlast intimidation every single time. Because in the end, the people who built something they didn't own weren't undone by demolition equipment or lawsuits. They were undone by the simple fact that land remembers, records don't lie, and accountability, once triggered, doesn't stop until it's finished.